Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today, we're exploring Maryland's unique witch trial history and current efforts to exonerate those accused of witchcraft in the colony.
While Maryland had fewer witch trials than its northern neighbors, these cases still resulted in tragedy, including the colony's only execution for witchcraft, that of Rebecca Fowler in 1685.
Today, we're joined by Elizabeth Pugliese-Shaw, a Maryland attorney who's leading the charge to bring justice to Maryland's accused witches.
She shares exciting news about a recently pre-filed legislative resolution that can finally clear their names.
Elizabeth also tells us about Moll Dyer, whose tragic story became a local legend and later inspired the Blair Witch Project.
And she explains how Maryland's status as a Catholic colony may have influenced its witch trial history.
Through our conversation, we explore how modern legal systems can address historical injustices, even centuries later.
Let's welcome Elizabeth Pugliese-Shaw to Witch Hunt.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast, Elizabeth Pugliese-Shaw. Please introduce yourself and tell us what you are doing for justice for accused witches.
My name's Elizabeth Pugliese-Shaw, and I'm an attorney in Maryland, mostly doing family law, but I decided to get involved with the Exonerating Witches Project when I happened to catch an article about the Connecticut Project. And I thought, well, that's really cool. Did Maryland ever exonerate its witches? Did Maryland even have anybody accused of witchcraft? I did some Googling and found out that there were people accused and that nobody has been ever exonerated. Reached out to y'all at the Connecticut Project, and you've helped me get started on it. So that's kind of how I got involved, is fell down a rabbit hole.
This is our first time visiting Maryland on the podcast. What would you like the viewers and listeners to know about your state?
Maryland was the first state to have religious toleration, and that was passed in 1649 was the Toleration Act. And that's mostly because Maryland was founded by Catholics and English Catholics at a time when England was Protestant. So to be able to freely worship, they had to tolerate Protestants. But it's a lovely state. There's a lot of history here. That's the thing. Of course, the Star-Spangled Banner was written in Baltimore Harbor. We have Fort McHenry that was being shelled there, Antietam from the Civil War, and of course, the close proximity to Washington means we get all of that spillover too. But it's a lovely state. It's small, but it has everything. It's got oceans, it's got mountains, it's got forests, it's got rural areas, it's got very large cities, and it's a great place to visit. And I do enjoy, I figured it out yesterday. I've been here over 20 years.
That's about the amount of time that I've spent in Colorado. It flies. It does fly.
It does.
So you asked yourself, what is the witch trial history here in Maryland? What got your attention when you started looking?
That we actually didn't have a witch trial hysteria like everybody knows about Salem, but we didn't really have that hysteria. You can pretty much count how many known people were accused on your hands. It's barely, I don't even think it's into double digits. So we didn't really have here in Maryland that, but we did have people accused, and one person was hung. So there were the miscarriages of justice. It just didn't blow up into this whole thing, which is probably why, other than Moll Dyer, and I'll get into her later because that's a whole industry practically, other than Moll Dyer, it's not really known about the people accused of witchcraft in Maryland because it just didn't make that big of an impression in the history of Maryland.
Is there any information on the one person who was hanged?
We are very lucky. The records were preserved of her trial. We actually have the records of the trial still here in the Maryland State Archives. We have it from all the known ones that actually went to trial. Their records, even though the St. Mary's County records burned because St. Annapolis became the capital, all those records were transferred. And so many of those records are still here in our capital. And you can actually go back and see the transcribed, thank God they've transcribed them, so that you can read them. You can actually see the records of what happened. I mean, it's not like a trial transcript like we think of today where they record everything, but you can see what date she was indicted and who the prosecutor was and who the people on the jury were, and the judges. And you can see that now because of all that got preserved.
And her name was Rebecca Fowler?
Yes,
The
that
one
was
hanged?
Rebecca Fowler. She was hanged indicted, convicted, and hanged all in 1685. They moved rather quickly on that one. They moved quickly on all the trials because that's just how trials were back then. There was none of this pretrial discovery and handing over information and months of preparation with depositions and everything. It was just pretty much accused, indicted, trial. Boom, it was over. And that was considered due process because you actually got a trial with 12 jurors.
I've started to dig a little deeper into the history, and I did notice, that these records are naming the men that were in the court, the ones making the decision, which you do see that in Connecticut on some of those trials too. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of names to look into and to learn about these men in the community.
Well, the main thing you have to remember about Maryland is it was what's called a royal proprietorship. It was founded by the Earls of Arundel, hence we have Anne Arundel, and Lord Baltimore. That's where we get Baltimore. The family name was Calvert County, St. Mary's, down there. It was pretty much a dictatorship. It was called the governor, but the Calverts picked the governor. Everybody was connected in some way to Calvert or the governor, who I think they were actually related by marriage anyway. So when you start getting into these people, it's really just basically the Calvert family or their business partners or something like that. So that's really what it is it's just this little clique was running everything. And so that's what you need to know about these men who were the commissioners and stuff, is they were really just the Calvert henchmen.
That's really insightful. I was looking at the other convicted person who did not hang, John Cowman, and he worked it off with the governor. So that kind of explains maybe how that.
Yeah, I don't know. We have the records, but we don't have the background. So we don't know anything. But my best guess is John Cowman was still an indentured servant at the time he was accused. And rather than lose the property of him by hanging him, they just made him work it off as what I call community service, although you're basically at the pleasure of the governor. So you're probably not doing real fun things, It would be more like convicted to hard labor. You got to live, but you were digging ditches and breaking rocks and that sort of thing. But I think that was it, is because he was an indentured servant, they just basically extended his indenture indefinitely.
Doing my research, I realized I need to learn more about the indentured servant history. There was a lot of that in Maryland.
Well, it was the only way people could afford to come over is, Rebecca Fowler, the one who was hanged, she was an indentured servant. She'd done her indenture. Then when she was done with it, she and her husband basically got hired out and they got married, but they still continued to work for others as servants, but now they got wages. And it was 20 years later before they could afford to buy their own land. So you're an indentured servant and your indenture is over, you're still poor. And in the dissertation, Witches and Poisoners, there's a good background on it, what it meant to be an indentured servant and how long it really took to establish yourself in the community. Maryland was also a slave state. So there were the free people, the indentured people, and the slaves. That was Maryland. It stayed a slave state right up until 1863.
You mentioned in part of the indentured servitude, part of that was just to pay for your passage to get across the ocean because that was an expensive journey to make. But not everybody who started that journey made it over here. I understand there were at least a couple of women on their way to Maryland that were accused of witchcraft on their ships. What could you tell us about those women?
Okay, the one I know best is Mary Lee. She was on a ship called the Charity of London, and it was coming, to Maryland. So I include her, even though she never set foot in Maryland. The ship hit bad weather, and sailors are among the most superstitious lot you have ever met. They still are. Trust me, you go on any U.S. Navy ship, they got their superstitions. And they decided that the bad weather was the result of having a witch on board. And there was Mary Lee, who was not well liked, little older, little cranky. And so they decided she was the witch. And the crew seized her and they were going to kill her right away. And the captain said, "No, you can't do that. I'm not going to be a part to murder." And I said, "We'll put her off in the Bahamas and it'll all be good." But the bad weather continued and they couldn't put in at Bahamas. So they've still got this woman on board that the crew does not want on board. The captain says, "I am not going to be a part of this." And he goes into his cabin. The next thing you know, somebody rushes in and says, "They've killed her." And they hung her at sea. Now the captain's like, "Not my fault. I told him not to do it. And I told him I didn't want any part of it." But honestly, he's the captain. He really should have done something. One book exonerates him as the crew was ready to mutiny. What was he supposed to do? I don't know, be a captain? So that was her. And the other one was, I want to say, I can't remember her name, but she comes up as another one who was hung at sea, and a relative of George Washington's lodged a complaint against the ship too. But then he didn't show up for the hearing, and so everything got dismissed. But it was pretty much the same thing as what happened to Mary Lee. Accused at sea, hung at sea, and then people wanted to look into what happened. And it was not really whether Mary Lee and this other woman were witches, but had murder been committed on board the ship. So that's kind of a positive thing, that they were actually looking at. They weren't presuming these women were witches. They were presuming murder had occurred on board. And I kind of like that, but she was still accused and she was still killed for being a witch, for being accused of being a witch.
Yeah. I know in a lot of the other circumstances when a witness isn't able to be there, that stopped a lot of witch trials from moving forward. But unfortunately with Washington, it was then the accountability for her death was dropped. But I think he might have been out of the country even.
I don't know. He was in
Yeah.
Virginia, so he would have had
Oh.
to travel to Maryland, and Maryland and Virginia were spatting a lot during this time. I don't think it was so much a well, it was kind of a border dispute, and it was also a religious dispute. So there was a lot of arguing back and forth then, which during one of those times was during Rebecca Fowler's trial. So the commissioners who were overseeing her trial also sat on the colony council advising Lord Baltimore. So they were a little distracted at the time trying to deal with whatever Virginia was doing at that time. And so they didn't really give a lot of thought to what was going on with the trial. They were just like, she's accused, whatever. Okay, we got to go deal with this big thing with Virginia trying to make us be Protestant. And that's where you get back into the problem with this was really all this little clique is they had their own concerns.
Yeah. Yeah. You had mentioned Mary Dyer or Moll Dyer
Yes.
earlier. Who was she?
Moll Dyer was a little lady who lived down in St. Mary's County, and not a lot is known about her. And in fact, for a while, it was wondered if she really even existed. But there's one great line that somebody found in a newspaper that she lived at the time that Cotton Mather was preaching. So we know we can, put her in a timeline there. And of course, Cotton Mather is all connected up to the Salem witch trials. So I always found that a great connection there. But Moll Dyer never made it to a trial. She was one cold night in the middle of winter. A bunch of men came to her little isolated cabin. She was a little old lady, a widow, came to her isolated cabin, drove her out into the middle of the night, set fire to the cabin so she couldn't come back, and just drove her out saying, "You're a witch. We don't want you in our community." Burned her home so she couldn't come back. She froze to death. And the legend is that she was gripping the rock on which she took shelter that night so hard that she left either her handprints or her knee prints, which tells you how accurate this is. They don't even know which body part it is. But she left her handprints or her knee prints in the rock. She was gripping it so hard. This rock has been moved to protect it to the St. Mary's Historical Society building. It's still outside, but it's got a gate around it so people don't touch it and ruin it. So that's how the legend of Moll Dyer began, is that she was clutching this, and then, of course, that she came back to take her revenge on those who drove her out to freeze to death. I'm kind of on her side here. Because I wouldn't be thrilled if that happened to me either. She is the very loose basis for the Blair Witch Project, for the Blair Witch, except they took the story from southern Maryland, where there are no mountains, and moved her up into the mountains in western Maryland and made her, kill children and stuff. And so it's very, very loosely based, but that's where the story comes from, is that Moll Dyer. And apparently there are still descendants of Moll Dyer living in southern Maryland. The St. Mary's Historical Society has all kinds of information on her, including, of course, who her relatives are and everything. What I would like to do is, if this exoneration gets through, is add to that plaque of, and she was exonerated in X year. Add to the marker of the stone. I think that would be the fitting tribute to her.
That would be wonderful. Her story, even though it's this inspiration for some really wild stories, her memory is so strong. When I was just listening to you talk about that horrible night, that is like an experience that accused witches today are experiencing, where they're banished out of their home into the elements without any person or protection. So it really, as much of a legend as she is, her story is also something that can really help us understand these accusations that persist today, unfortunately.
And that's also why the resolution says known and unknown, because we don't know how many other Moll Dyers. She made it because somebody decided this rock looked like it had handprints or knee prints on it. And so she persisted in legend, but we don't know how many other people this same thing happened to, because nobody was recording, "Oh yeah, we drove the local witch out today and burned her house or burned his house." Nobody's writing that down in the diary, because you get all head up and you do it, and then the next day you go, "What did we just do?" And you kind of keep it secret. So that's why it's known and unknown, because we don't know how many other Moll Dyers there were in Maryland.
Yeah, a lot of times the legend is as important to an area as the real history behind the person. And it reminds me of cases we've heard in New Hampshire with Goody Cole and Virginia with Grace Sherwood, the so-called Witch of Pungo, where the lore has become one thing because there's little information about the real people. So all the blanks get filled in and the stories get elaborated. And that in itself somehow becomes important to the community that may have had, in those cases, New Hampshire, Virginia, and Maryland, not so many witch trials that we're aware of. What do you think she means today, Moll Dyer, to the community, to people in Maryland? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, she's obviously St. Mary's County is quite proud of her. Like I said, they actually moved and preserved the rock. They have a lot of stuff about her. She winds up in all the books about legends of Maryland and such, which I don't want to mess with that lore and stuff, but I want it to be, this was a real person. This was a real little old lady who had something horrible happen to her. But it is very much right up there with Grace Sherwood. There's books written about Moll Dyer and all that thing. Heck, they took her story and made it into a blockbuster movie. I remember when everybody was talking about the Blair Witch Project. It's very important to the lore, and I'm sure it gets people into the Historical Society, which is probably underfunded and can only do so much. So I'm all for anything that gets people to support a historical society. And I don't think this legend hurts anybody because it really does tell the story of what happened to her. That they don't make it sound like it was a good thing she was driven out. Okay. They very much emphasize the fact that she froze to death. They very much. So I think that really helps. It's not this big myth that makes it out like this was a good thing done, but just points out, what can happen with group hysteria. It leads to a little old lady dying.
It's so meaningful that the St. Mary's Historical Society brought her to life by identifying her in the record and who are her possible descendants. I think that was really a wonderful effort.
Speaking of descendants, have you met anyone yet in your work on this project who's come to you saying they're descended from one of the accused?
I haven't met them, and I've only exchanged a couple emails with people who are distant cousins of Rebecca Fowler. Of all the ones who have been accused, because some of them didn't have kids. It would be hard to find descendants of them. But to find Rebecca Fowler, distant cousins, is interesting. They haven't really gotten back to me on it. They haven't said they're against her being exonerated. They haven't said they're for. But I have found that they are distant cousins of Rebecca Fowler. But that's the only ones I've come across. I said there's descendants of Moll Dyer. Maybe if there's getting more information out there, they might reach out to me. I haven't made it down to the Historical Society yet to let these folks know about the project, to say, hey, if any Dyers want to get in touch with me, here's how, just because they have weird open hours that don't really align with my work schedule.
And you have a website that you've created. It talks a little bit about the victims, and the public can contact you about the project.
It is the Maryland Witch. If you look for, and I use MD instead of having to write out Maryland all the time. So if you just search for Maryland Witch Exoneration Project, it will probably come up. It's a WordPress site. It's got quick biographies on each of them with basically what's known, some surmises, which I say, I think this is, or he or she was probably this. And it gives a little of the background into what was going on in Maryland at the time of the accusations. And then it's a biography on each of them. And then there's a contact page where people can just email me if they want to know more or get in touch with the project.
So what's the status of the project right now? Where do things stand and what still needs to be done?
I'm very excited I luckily got to see a state delegate. And I started talking to her about the project, and she has pre-filed a bill or a resolution for this upcoming session that starts on Wednesday, January 8th, to just exonerate the witches of Maryland. And it's just a pretty simple bill. It mostly follows the wording of the Connecticut bill, but that has been introduced. We will see. It's got to go through committees and all of that through committees, and then got to go up to vote. We're hoping it's not too much of a fight, but you'd be amazed at what legislators can find to argue over. And you can go find that on the state legislature website. I do have to get it up on my website about it and put it on the Facebook page too. It is HJ2. Yeah, criminal law is what it is. And it's up there and anybody can go read it.
Thank you. And by the way, we'll have all these links in the show notes. So when people read the description of the episode, they'll be able to click on that. We'll
Oh,
put
good,
them
because
in
I
the-
can't remember where my
Yeah,
website is.
it's hard to like remember URLs, especially the ones that those legislator sites have, because when you actually look at it, there's a lot of special characters and
Yeah, but if you just go to the Maryland legislature page, it does have a bill search, and so that's really great
Yeah,
to find.
HJ0002.
It's 3 zeros and a 2. I want to say that's a 2, but I can't read my handwriting right now. And if I can't read it, nobody else can.
And also, if people are on Facebook and they want to come learn or chat about this effort, you have a Facebook group they can join.
Yes, it's a public group, so you can find it by searching. Again, it's MD Witches Exoneration Project. I just had to look for it myself today. The main thing to remember is always it's MD. I just shortened Maryland to MD to save space and typing. So that makes it a little easier to find everything.
How much would it cost to get this legislation passed?
I don't think there's going to be, other than travel, because it's a resolution. It's not a bill. It's not going to cost anything in the budget or anything. It's just basically, unless you have travel costs, getting to Annapolis to testify, it's going to be, to me, it's a budget neutral bill. It's no cost because the delegate is presenting it and it's going to go through all the process and everything, and it passes and it gets published. What's one more bill, more or less, that gets published?
Yeah, it costs nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why does justice matter for these persons today?
Because it was wrong. We have to correct wrongs. Not to put it on the same level as the more known death penalty exoneration cases. But, we release people from death row after 20, 30 years on death row because DNA clears them. This is not at the same level. It's historic and nothing's bringing back Rebecca Fowler. But it has to do with just honesty. We have to be truthful. We have to be fair. We have to be just. Otherwise, what's the point of having a country? You have to do it for the welfare of everyone, not just rich people. You have to do it for the poor people, the powerless people who didn't have anybody to speak for them at the time.
Do you think a monument or a memorial for all of them would be something that would interest the community down the road?
Probably. Maryland loves their memorials and things. Goodness knows there's anywhere you turn, there's a historic sign or there's a statue of something or other there. I know in St. Mary's, they still have the courthouse. It's probably rebuilt and, but the historic courthouse, they've restored it to what it would have looked like then. And I think something there that talks about what happened to the miscarriages of justice might not be a bad idea, even if it's just a plaque on the wall that says, yes, we had witch trials here. They were wrong. Or something in Annapolis, goodness knows. Annapolis is very special because it has, not only is it the state capital, but the Kunta Kinte statues are there. Okay, they have right there on the waterfront because Alex Haley reading to little children, because it's believed that it was that Kunta Kinte, Alex Haley's ancestor, came through Annapolis when he was brought over. So I think having the witch exoneration, again, not on the same level as slavery. I'm not trying to say these are equivalent or anything, but just if we can acknowledge that wrong, let's acknowledge this other wrong there. Plus, it's a state capital. People are always wandering around. We've got the Naval Academy there. Let's have some positive values that the midshipmen can see.
I would think just with the renown of Moll Dyer alone, there would be some demand or interest in doing something like that.
There probably will be. We just right now the project is pretty much me, and I
Yeah.
haven't done a lot of the publicity and stuff. The fact that I had the courage to even speak to the delegate and go, "Hey, could you consider this?" And then she took it and ran with it just still amazes me because I'm terrible at self-promotion. But I think once this is over, yeah, I can see St. Mary's maybe again at the Historical Society putting something up. Like I said, my dream is to have on the Moll Dyer rock an additional plaque that says, yeah, this terrible thing happened, but she was exonerated in X year. And if it could include all of something to everybody, because it was mostly St. Mary's County, simply because that's where everybody was at the time. They were still kind of moving. Where Rebecca Fowler lived at the time actually became Prince George's County, but St. Mary's County was pretty much everything. So everything at the time. So I think St. Mary's County might be an appropriate place. I'm sure the Historical Society would love the attention. Again, support your local historical society.
Absolutely. And I'm really grateful for your courage. It's a really admirable example to those who have they have a voice too, and they may not feel like amplifying something because it's so scary or they're alone and they don't have collaborators yet. But you just put yourself out there, and it's delegates like yours that are making these bills successful. I'm so grateful to their work in Connecticut. Jane Garibay and Saud Anwar, they prioritized it. They had a lot of other very important bills during the same session, healthcare bills, elder care bills, but they also recognized that historical justice matters today, that it matters for their community today and globally, that this is a big deal. And when we take a stand on this, we're helping the rest of the world that has people suffering for the same reason. So I'm really grateful for your bold move and for just, and it is just one step at a time. And it doesn't have to be this fireworks and crazy campaign. It's just moving towards justice. Taking action like this is significant and it matters to many people. So thank you.
Well, your support, the Connecticut people's support, y'all's support, regular check-ins have really helped keep me on track and keep it going. And Delegate Bagnell, who is the one who introduced it, she loves to apparently introduce and support some of the more politically risky things because that's just who she is. And she does have a lot going on here in Maryland. The Key Bridge being rebuilt is huge, and that is sucking all the air out of everything. So the fact that she found time to prioritize this and not just prioritize it, but get the wording in and get it pre-filed. So it has a much better chance of getting through this session. Because in Maryland, our sessions are really short. It's like January 8th to something like May, and that's it. And there's a crossover day where if a bill doesn't get sent to the other house by this date, it's dead this session. So by pre-filing it, she has a better chance of getting it through this session than if she were to introduce it later. So it's really, I'm really grateful to her that even with all her other priorities, she decided that what the heck, go for broke this year and see what we get.
Yeah. It's one of those things that even though voting on party lines is typical and expected, it's one of those bills that anyone can and should stand behind. And that did happen in Connecticut at the beginning. It we didn't know if it was going to get out of the first committee. But as it moved through the steps, more and more support came. And I hope and expect, I think we'll see that in Maryland too.
It's really amazing to watch the progress of this effort. It wasn't that long ago that you first initiated this.
No, I can't remember. It was right about the time Connecticut was passing their bill. Like I said, I saw the article and reached out to y'all. And then I just kind of did some work and stuff and was thinking about creating the website and all this stuff and was mostly just doing the research. But I ran into Delegate Bagnell last April, and that really kickstarted it. That was when I said, "Hey, by the way, can I talk to you about this?" And she was so excited that I just went, fantastic. This is somebody who can actually get it, do something about this. And then it's been moving along since then. I checked in. Do you need anything from me? Do you want to do this? Without bugging her, because again, she's got a lot of other priorities. And I was really amazed when they sent me the resolution. I'm like, holy cow, this is happening.
This was so great, Elizabeth. Is there anything else you would like to mention or discuss?
We talked about those who were convicted, but one thing that that was interesting about Maryland is there were people who had trial. One woman was accused and she wasn't even indicted. It just went nowhere. And that really surprised me that they presented this. And back then, it's not like you could put on a defense or anything. It's like grand juries today. Hey, we can indict a ham sandwich. So the fact that she wasn't even indicted, that was Elizabeth Bennet in 1665. She wasn't even indicted. They just cleared her name. Technically, she's been cleared, but I still include her on the list because she shouldn't have been accused in the first place. And then two others, Hannah Edwards in 1686, which was the year, just a few months actually, she was accused after Rebecca Fowler was hung. She was actually tried but found not guilty. Now, the big difference there is she had been married. Her first husband had been a very prominent member of the community. Her second husband, not as prominent, and the person who accused her was, I'm surprised, not accused herself because she was the cranky little old lady that nobody liked and went around making everybody miserable. So I'm really surprised at who was accused versus who wasn't in that one. And so I'm sure Hannah Edwards had people who testified on her behalf that no, she's this good, righteous woman who goes to church every Sunday. The last one was Virgil Vial all the way in 1712. She is, as far as we know, the last person indicted for witchcraft in the state of Maryland. Mostly because the statute was repealed about 8 years later. Like I said, we didn't have the whole hysteria, so people weren't getting accused every year, sort of thing. There were big breaks where people weren't getting accused. But she was also sent to trial and found not guilty. So that's pretty much it for the state of Maryland. Is, like I said, you can count on two hands. It's not even double digits, those who were accused. But they shouldn't have been accused anyway. They should not have, been faced with even being indicted. They shouldn't have been driven out of their homes. I'm sure even for those who were found not guilty or cleared and not indicted, going back to their communities was probably tough. It's not known anything about their lives afterwards, but I'm sure it wasn't real easy. I'm sure there were whisper campaigns and that sort of thing. Nobody should have been accused because witchcraft, as claimed of what they did, does not exist.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has really been quite wonderful. I really enjoy, one of the things I love about doing the show is learning the local histories of different places. And my mother's family was originally from Maryland, had lived there for a couple hundred years before starting to move west. So interesting to learn about the colonial history there as well.
Yeah, I hadn't known so much about things until I got really into this. Like in Annapolis, I told you there's things all over the place and everything. Near the World War II memorial is a sign about the Battle of Severn. And I'm like, Battle of Severn? This is a colonial one. Apparently, at one point, the Protestants had taken over the government of Maryland. And this was at the time they had the Commonwealth in England. Lord Baltimore, the Calverts, they were royalists. They said, you can't really be royalists anymore. We've got the Commonwealth. We're running things now. And the interesting thing about that was it was 1654. The Battle of Severn was 1655. Mary Lee was hung at sea in 1654. So when you realize that this was really a clash between the Protestants and the Catholics, is it because we were really a Catholic-dominated colony that we didn't really have the witch hunts? Don't know. Because certainly knows in Europe, before Martin Luther and the Protestants, there were plenty of witch hunts. So it's not like the Catholics didn't do that.
And I believe Maryland was following English witchcraft law. There was no additional laws.
Correct. It was the statute of King James that they were following. And with the whole thing about spectral evidence, I can just imagine trying to get that through court now. Oh, you can't really see what's happening, but trust me, it is. Yeah. The judges won't even let us use a video unless it can be preserved in the final record somehow. And it's a written record, so we have to give the court a flash drive that they can clip in the file. So I just can't imagine trying to get spectral evidence through today. I just can't.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
So, yeah. But again, Maryland just didn't have what some of the more northern colonies had, and pure luck is that I'm going to put it down to. You can look at it as, okay, maybe it was because how the colony was run, maybe it's because it was Catholic. Pure luck. That's all I'm going to say it was. It's just there, but for the grace of God, it's what it was. That nobody decided that there was a whole bunch of witches hanging out somewhere. We just got lucky.
Yeah. Out of the colonies, it was basically Massachusetts and Connecticut that had the overwhelming majority of all the cases were in just those two colonies alone. And even the ones that happened in Maine and New Hampshire, those colonies were under Massachusetts control at the time of most of the witch charges. So Eunice Cole of Hampton, New Hampshire was tried in Boston because Massachusetts was running it. So it's really those two colonies. And then you look at the others, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Virginia, not so much.
And when you look at the timeline, most of Maryland's occurred before Salem. The only ones that occurred after Salem were Moll Dyer and Virgil Vial. Everything else was before then. So if there was going to be an outbreak, it would have happened before then. Because I think after Salem, everybody was like, we need to rethink this thing a little bit. This is a little crazy. The fact that when you look at it, that we could have been just as bad. It could have had this outbreak because there was a lot of hysteria about it. And people just, you have a bad season and you want to blame somebody. You can't just blame climate change or the weather. You want to blame something that was in your control. This lady cursed my cows. That's why they're not giving good milk. Not, I fed them bad grain because I wasn't paying attention when I bought it, or that's all I could afford. Because that's in your control. You can go to the sheriff and say, this lady's a witch, and the sheriff will arrest her. You can do that. You don't have any control over, just as my crops were in, we got a big storm in that knocked, just as the crops were just coming up perfectly, we got a big storm in that knocked them all to the ground and destroyed them. You can't control the weather.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you again for all your support throughout this project. And I look forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Mary Bingham is back with a Minute with Mary.
You've just heard that women accused of witchcraft were banished from their communities, thrown out, not knowing how they were going to survive. This is still true for women accused today. Women in Ghana are banished to witch camps because their own families sometimes accuse them of using witchcraft to cause fires, sickness, and crop failures, among many other things. I encourage you to listen to the Witch Hunt Show episode titled Witchcraft Accusations in Ghana with John Azuma. The link is in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And now Sarah has End Witch Hunts news.
Historical injustices mirror ongoing witchcraft accusation persecution worldwide. Our mission to end witch hunts rightly connects colonial American victims to those suffering from witchcraft accusations today. By breaking the silence around these cases, we forge a path toward justice for all victims, past and present. Our campaign for colonial witch trial exonerations continues to gain momentum following Connecticut's landmark 2023 passage of H.J. 34, a resolution concerning certain witchcraft convictions in colonial Connecticut. This success is now followed by similar legislative efforts across former colonies, with two critical initiatives currently needing public support and community advocacy. Massachusetts HD 3054, an act exonerating certain individuals accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts, seeks historic justice for 8 pre-Salem victims, including 5 who were executed in Boston. Maryland's HJ2, exonerating those accused, tried, or convicted of witchcraft in the province of Maryland prior to the American Revolution, aims to address their colonial-era witch trial convictions. Both bills are currently in committee and will require community advocacy of public testimony for advancement. These victims can no longer speak to their own innocence. We can do that. You can do that. These efforts build on decades of progress, from the initial Massachusetts 1957 Act to the recent Elizabeth Johnson Jr. exoneration in 2022 and the 2023 passage of absolution in Connecticut. However, many colonial witch trial victims remain without recognition or justice. The current initiatives acknowledge that witch hunts extended beyond Salem, affecting innocent men, women, and children across multiple colonies. Your voice is crucial. There are 2 important petitions for you to sign now. Please sign to support Massachusetts at change.org/witch trials. And also, please sign to support Maryland at change.org/MD witch trials. Whether you're a descendant or concerned citizen, you can support these bills by emailing words of support to the legislators voting, submitting written testimony of support, or speaking in support at the approaching committee hearings. Connecticut's successful testimonies provide an excellent template for effective advocacy. This work connects directly to our mission of ending witch hunts globally, recognizing that historical injustices mirror ongoing persecution. Join us in breaking the silence and securing long overdue justice for these victims. For guidance on submitting testimony or getting involved, visit our website or reference Connecticut's public testimony records from HJ 34. Links are in the show notes.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us in this episode of Witch Hunt.
Spend time with us again next week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.